Welcome back to The Critique. Today we're looking at a two-part documentary script, 80 Tons, The Third Lebanon War. It's a really heavy piece, covering everything from October 7th to a new security zone.
It's incredibly ambitious, and the access the writer has is, well, it's something else.
It really is. So let's get right into it. The first big thing that jumps out at me, and I think we should start here, is the transition from that early war defensive anxiety to the offensive triumph of the pager operation. It just lacks a clear bridge on the intelligence side.
Right. That's a great way to put it. The script does an amazing job building that initial tension, the battle for time.
Oh, absolutely.
You hear the commanders admitting they're losing, that whole bit about needing 36 hours when the enemy only needs 6, and that line about soldiers feeling like ducks in a shooting range. It's so visceral.
It is. The stakes are perfectly set, but then it almost immediately jumps to the pager operation. It just sort of happens. It lands like a deus ex machina.
And I wonder how that really plays for an audience. 1 minute you're showing total defensive panic, 3,000 fighters about to pour over the border.
Yeah.
And then the next, poof, the enemy's pagers are exploding. It feels like a gap. It's missing that connective tissue. The how. How did the IDF actually use that long waiting period to make the attack possible?
Exactly. The core suggestion here is that the writer needs to show that the waiting wasn't passive. Right now, it feels like they were just taking hits until, some magic button got pushed.
So to fix that, you'd need to connect that learning competition idea that the commanders mentioned directly to the offensive success.
Precisely. Show, don't just tell.
What if we lean into the idea of the hunt? I mean, there's that quote in there from a commander talking about the battle for operational learning. He specifically says they were hunting cell leaders during those months.
That's the key. That's the thread. Instead of introducing the pager attack as this total shock the day the enemy was hurt without knowing how, frame it as the payoff for all that painstaking surveillance.
Right. Because the script mentions that operatives got careless, that they exposed themselves. Let's see that.
Yes, explicitly link that commander's frustration, about not seeing smoke mushrooms, that feeling of impotence.
Link that directly to the quiet intelligence work that was happening in the background. It would totally reframe that entire period.
And what about that statistic, the 70% of fire capabilities that were eventually destroyed? You could show that they spent that whole passive year just mapping those targets one by one.
I see. So it changes the narrative from we got lucky with a gadget to something more like we won the intelligence war first.
It justifies the wait. It answers that soldier's question of, why are we just standing here? Because while you were standing there, intelligence was mapping the enemy's pocket. It makes the battle for time a strategic asset, not just a liability.
And the pager attack becomes the earned payoff, not a magic trick. It's a procedural that ends in an explosion.
Exactly. Okay, so moving on from that, let's talk about the ground maneuver itself. This brings us to the second point. The portrayal of the maneuver has this contradiction between the hollowed-out enemy and the massive infrastructure they find, and it kind of dilutes the threat.
This is a tricky one. I really felt the script oscillating. On the one hand, it's celebrating, right? The enemy ran away. They didn't show up to the fight.
There's relief there.
A lot of relief. But then the title is 80 Ton. The whole framing is about this massive existential war. If the enemy just fled, the audience is left wondering, well, why was it 80 tons? Was it really a war?
It's that tension between the potential threat and the actual resistance they met. It needs to be resolved more sharply.
Because right now it sounds a little like, look how scary this could have been, but also nobody was home.
So the suggestion is to reframe that lack of an enemy, not as a sign of weakness, but actually as a validation of the preemptive strikes.
Interesting.
Focus less on the empty space where the fighters should have been and more on the infrastructure they left behind. That's what justifies the scale of the operation.
So instead of we won because they're cowards, the argument becomes look at the horrifying death trap they built.
Exact. Highlight those specific details from the script. That living room leading to a strategic tunnel.
Oh, yeah. And the Cornet missiles under the daughter's room? That stuff is terrifying. It just needs to be front and center.
You could even contrast the visuals. You have the eerie abandoned village, but then you immediately cut to an inventory of the weapons found in every single house.
And use that commander's quote, the one about expecting charges, anti-tank fire, and ambush, but finding abandonment.
Yes. and use it to explicitly argue that the year of attrition, the battle for time we just talked about, is what broke their spirit before the tanks ever rolled in.
So the enemy wasn't just coward. They were dismantled psychologically and logistically before the ground invasion even began.
Correct. It proved the Third Lebanon War was really won in that earlier intelligence and air phase. The ground part was a mopping up operation, but for infrastructure, not people.
That's a powerful way to frame it. The antagonist shifts. It's not the Hezbollah fighter anymore.
No.
It's the house itself. The village is the monster. And finding its anatomy, the tunnels and the weapons caches, that becomes the climax.
It totally justifies the 80 tons framing. The explosives weren't for men. They were to dismantle a fortress disguised as a town. And that brings us to the aftermath.
The conclusion.
Right. Which leads to our third critique. The ending leans so heavily on this military optimism, but it feels tonally dissonant when you set it against the reality of the destroyed Israeli north.
I felt this one strongly. The script ends with what? Birds chirping? Commanders are optimistic, talking about the security zone, the 5 strategic points.
You get all these quotes like, "We are strong now," and "zero tolerance."
But in the same breath, you have this admission that Menara is 70% destroyed, uninhabitable, water, electricity, all gone.
It's a really stark contrast. And the risk is that the pure "we won" narrative alienates the audience, who can see the ruins of the kibbutz. The victory feels a little hollow, a little forced.
So the idea is to just embrace that. Call it what it is. A bittersweet victory, not a pure military triumph.
Exactly. Acknowledge that the tactical success in Lebanon was paid for by the strategic destruction of Israel's own border towns. You have to be honest about that cost.
How would you do that, though, concretely?
Well, when the script talks about the return of the residents, use that Menara data point, 70% destruction, to directly challenge the easy timeline of victory.
Okay, so instead of just ending with the commander's optimism,
You pair it immediately with the resident's skepticism. There's that incredible line where the resident says, "I shouted with all my might. You won't enforce the buffer zone." Don't hide that. Let it breathe.
so the 5 strategic points the IDF is holding become less of a boast and more of a piece of collateral.
The only collateral. It's the only thing that might convince those skeptical residents to even consider coming back. It acknowledges that trust has been completely broken since 2006.
That's so much more powerful. It's not, "Trust us, we're strong." It's, "We know you don't trust us, so look at these 5 hills we're holding inside their territory as an insurance policy."
It grounds the whole ending in reality. It's a much more mature and credible narrative. The victory is real, but so is the trauma. And speaking of that insurance policy, that brings us to the mechanics of it.
The new security zone.
Yes, our last point. The script relies on the audience just accepting that this time is different without really explaining the strategic mechanism.
We hear all the right phrases, you know? Security zone, zero tolerance, if they lift their nose, they get hit. But we've heard that before.
Many times. It sounds like standard military rhetoric. What the listener needs to understand is why this specific setup, holding 5 points inside Lebanon, is strategically, physically different from what came before.
It's not just about will, it's about physics, the geometry of the defense.
That's the perfect way to put it. The suggestion is to deepen the analysis of the enforcement mechanism, move beyond arguments about spirit, and get into the tactical reality.
Like drilling down into the geography, the script mentions being able to see the ruined villages from those 5 points.
Exactly. Explain how holding the high ground physically prevents the return of direct fire anti-tank weapons. That was the number one fear in Part 1, those missiles coming straight into living rooms. If you hold the ridge, you eliminate the line of sight. It's that simple.
And you could use that tragic story from Majdal Shams, the soccer field, where the rocket overshot the military camp.
Use that as a concrete example of why distance, the buffer zone, is the only real defense against that kind of weapon. The argument for the 5 points becomes about physics, not just morale. Distance is safety.
But what about the gray zone? The war ends, but it's not peace. How do you stop Hezbollah from just creeping back?
The script needs to challenge its own zero-tolerance policy. It mentions specialized units for enforcement. It needs to expand on that. How do those units prevent the creeping return that happened between 2006 and 2023?
So it's not just, "We'll shoot." It's, "We have a dedicated unit whose only job is to watch these specific valleys to make a creeping return physically impossible."
Exactly. It turns a slogan into a strategy.
It asks the audience to trust the military's geometry, not just its word. And geometry is a lot harder to argue with.
That really tightens the whole thing up. It feels like a complete arc then.
I think so too. Okay, let's just briefly recap the main actionable points for the writer.
First, bridge that intelligence gap. Show the hunt that made the pager attack possible. The defensive silence wasn't weakness, it was the weapon being loaded.
Second, resolve the tension around the fleeing enemy. Use the infrastructure they left behind to justify the 80-ton scale. The enemy wasn't the fighter who fled, it was the fortress he built.
Third, balance the tone of the end. Acknowledge the destruction of Manara. Embrace the bittersweet victory to build credibility.
And finally, rigorously define the mechanics of the new security zone. Explain the physics of the 5 points and the gray zone enforcement. Don't just tell why this time is different.
It's a really strong piece of work. With those changes, I think it could be definitive.
We would genuinely love to see how you implement these ideas. Please refine the narrative, tighten those connections, and submit the next draft for a final review.
Absolutely. Good luck with the writing.
This has been The Critique. Keep writing, keep improving, and we'll see you next time.